Welcome, everyone, and thanks for attending. It's great to have many of our finance leaders here from our Chief Financial Officer community, as well as new faces. As many of you may know, we've recently launched our newest course on SaaS finance, where we share the fundamentals of budgeting, forecasting, and how finance is a growth lever for any startup or enterprise. Today, we wanted to include founders, finance professionals, and even business school students interested in SaaS fundamentals to join this special event. Everyone here today has already or will get access to the full SaaS finance course. If you manage a team or have a friend or founder you think would benefit from this course, be sure to send them this link, bvp.com/finance-course. At Bessemer, the Atlas team has been growing our finance-related library because we know it's foundational to building incredible and enduring businesses. And in light of 2023, going back to basics is critical. Between rising inflation and interest rate hikes, the Silicon Valley Bank crisis, and ongoing layoffs, it's been a difficult time to operate and grow a software business. Startups and growth stage enterprises alike have had to face challenging decisions and conversations. It's a reminder that the work we do as finance and strategy professionals is critical in helping CEOs chart their course and make critical decisions as businesses grow and scale. To that end, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our three panelists at the State of SaaS Finance. Now, I believe we have many aspiring entrepreneurs on today's call, those that are still in undergrad or at B school. So to warm us up, I thought we'd let our panelists introduce themselves and share their alma mater. If you hear about your school, let us know in the chat. Elena, why don't you start us off?
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks for having me, and I'm excited to be here with my colleagues here. I am the CFO of Toast, and I have been there about 2.5 years or so. Feels like 10, but only 2.5. And my alma mater is Cal Berkeley, so go Bears.
Thanks, Elena. Hi, everybody. Chris Garber, pleasure to be with you all. I'm the CFO of Guild. Today is actually my 2-year anniversary with Guild, and I share Elena's sentiment. Feels like dog years at this point. That's probably true for most CFO roles. My alma mater is Santa Clara University, so go Broncos.
Thanks, Chris. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dave Sherry. I'm the CFO of ServiceTitan. I'm the newest of the group here. I've been in the job for about 3 months. Previously, the CFO of a company called Quinto Andar down in Brazil. And my alma mater is the University of Michigan. Go Blue.
Okay, so let's get to the conversation. Each of our CFOs, please feel free to agree or disagree with each other or share your point of view. And at the end of our conversation, we'll move into the audience Q&A session. So we'll start with 2023. It's been a volatile year. As we've said, with the interest rates have gone up, there's inflation. Recently, the IPO market has opened a little bit. Stock prices are recovering somewhat, and there have been some favorable earnings reports. But we've been through a big bull market a couple of years ago in technology stocks, and then a bear market. Now there seems to be a recovery. What makes a great CFO in either a bull or a bear market?
Jeff, I'll kick that off. So I think there's a lot of consistency, if I were to answer that high level, across both a bull and a bear market. There's some things that look different, but regardless of what the market is, I think there's a few things I think about for a CFO. One is be a trusted advisor to your CEO, and that sounds like a cliche word, but it is so important that you're very connected with your CEO, and also have the confidence to be the truth teller to him or her. Hopefully lots of hers out there, by the way, in the CEO seat. I think number 2, besides being a trusted advisor, is have a deep understanding of all the stakeholders are in and around your company, and that could be investors, it could be employees, obviously we all know that, and then it could be the board. And so just making sure you're very clear on who those stakeholders are, how decisions you're making as a management team impact those stakeholders, and again, helping the CEO also see that and look around corners. And then the last one, I'm stating the obvious, is having a deep knowledge of the operations. Like, you can make a decision in your seat as a CFO or a CEO, but then really deeply understanding what is the implication of that decision downstream. What are the risks? What are the opportunities? And in understanding that, I think it allows you to make improved, better decisions. I think what might be different in the last few years is having to manage those stakeholders has become increasingly important, and setting those expectations with them about the business the backdrop we're operating in has been increasingly important in the last, call it 2 years.
Yeah, I'll add. I think I agree 100%, Elena. I don't, Chris, if you had anything to add. Two things I think are worth adding is both in the bull market, which is sort of harder, in the bear market, it's kind of obvious. Our job is the risk manager in chief. And I think that it's easy to forget the risk management part in the bull market because capital is so available, and that's probably the biggest risk that we face. And so our job, I believe, as a CFO, is to make sure that the company always has a fully funded plan. Maybe when you're a public company, it's a bit different because the access to capital is much easier and faster. But the truth is, you can never be in a position where you put the company's life at risk. So that's the first one. And I think it's very, very obvious now. It was very not obvious in 2021 how important it is to be the fully funded plan driver in chief. And it at times forces unpopular decisions. That's the first thing I would say. And the second one is the CFO seat tends to be pretty lonely because there aren't your CEO probably won't want to focus on many of the things that you do, and your job as part of risk management and driving data-driven decisions is one where you need benchmarks and support. And that's where the beauty of having the CFO community is really important. Elena mentioned advisors, and I have the opportunity to talk to her from time to time with her wealth of experience and with other CFOs. I think that, I talk to the CFO of Procore from time to time, this guy, Howard Fu. I talk to the other CFOs, and you learn a lot from great CFOs because what we do is different. And so I would say to be a great CFO requires constant appetite for learning and from learning from other people in the world. And Jeff, who's the panelist in this call, is my mentor for the last 10 years. And I think if you want to be great at what you do, you can't learn it all on your own. And so that's the one thing I would say, both in a bull market and in a bear market and in moments that change, the key is to learn from others because there are people who've been through it. And if you learn it on your own, you're not going to succeed no matter how smart you are.
I love that, Dave. I think just maybe building on that for a second, I think when I was listening to the question, the first thing that came to my mind is like, the CFO, part of the CFO's job is to be able to lead in kind of any environment, because that is the thing that's going to be it's going to be unpredictable. And I think we're seeing over the last year or two just how true that is. And so to, let's say, earn that trust that Elena talked about, demonstrating the range, demonstrating the ability to operate at different altitudes, to see the strategy, but also be really relevant operationally, where you can connect the decision-making in the company, I think is essential. Is like one of the things I think about on trying to earn the trust of the team, is really being able to show that, hey, we can connect data and reality on the ground in the business to the left-right decisions that we want to make at the company. I think the two other things I've been thinking a lot about and that I try to do at Guild, one is really just championing how important building the maturity and the capabilities of our business are. As kind of a company that's in the scale up phase, we're over 1,000 employees. We're not a tiny startup anymore. And so those scale capabilities in our company are really critical, and championing that from the CFO seat, both about cost, but also about what it means for us operationally, is really important. And then I think in a bear market, different than a bull market, I always say, like, when the market is tough, the company and the management team have to learn to sort of walk and chew gum at the same time. You can't just have one play and run it over and over and over again. And so again, from my seat, I really try to bring that lens to the table in enabling our CEO, my partners on the leadership team, to really think about balancing those priorities versus, hey, we can just focus on one path and only do that.
Okay, let's shift to our next topic. When it comes to the fundamentals of budgeting and forecasting, every CFO approaches planning differently. It's as much of an art as a science. So there's a two-part question. How do each of you approach budgeting when the business's key goal is growth? And then how do you balance growth with profitability? Chris, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And I think probably many of the folks listening in have read think an article that you published on the Goldilocks budget, but if anyone hasn't read that, go Google it, look it up. It's a really awesome outline that I think gets to some of the questions here. I think about a few things, and you talked about growth and profitability. In the spirit of, companies that can walk and chew gum at the same time, it is really essential that you're planning for both those things. So one, sort of thinking aspirationally about growth and making sure that your team has the right targets. And in some ways, those need to be aspirational on being a little bit over the horizon. But then thinking about profitability is making sure the way that you are intentional about setting cost targets or setting your profitability goals is that you don't get over your skis. And so one of the ways that I know, Jeff, you've outlined that the way we think about it at Guild is we use kind of scenario planning to do that. And so we think about setting our goals on sort of a good, better, best basis, from how we think about quotas in the field, how we think about our, some of our consumption revenue. But at the same time, when we then make a plan for profitability, we don't assume that everything's going to go right. And so we use some of those more conservative scenarios to actually plan our cost and our resource goals. And then when we start to run ahead against our plan on the growth side, we know we have some dry powder in the middle that then we can double down and maybe make some investments that we didn't want to green light like right on day one. Again, just trying to strike that balance. And so the way we operate to do that then is more on a monthly, quarterly basis. We're always coming back to our plan and both assessing like how are we doing against it, but also what sort of course corrections do we need to make along the way.
Very good, Elena.
Yeah, like I think one of the most important things that we do is that we think about planning and budgeting in sort of four phases. And the first phase is, having the context outside of your company. So like in Q1, let's say we do an outside-in view of the company. What's the competitive landscape? What are the chess moves that are going to happen around our company? If X company buys Y company, what might we do? That's sort of an outside-in view. And then we follow that up very quickly with what is our long-term strategy? And that long-term strategy, like about 3 years out. And we do that so it's sort of a North Star. Everyone understands if our North Star is X, then what does that imply around budgets and planning for the next year? And then we follow that up with, once we have sort of our long range strategic plan, with an annual plan. And that plan puts the headlights out, basically a year. And we always anchor back to strategy as a starting point. And then we follow that up in Q4 with OKRs and MBOs and sort of the operationalizing of the plan. That's sort of the framework we follow. To build on Chris's point, though, tactically, there's a few things we're doing every year, and this year, of course, even more important, but scenario planning, absolutely, good, better, best. And then also contingency planning, both on the revenue side and on the expense side, and debating how much contingency do we need to hold if the macro changes X or Y. And for us, in a business that's very dynamic with payment volume, we just have to be really thoughtful about that. It's slightly different than a business that's just pure SaaS. I used to love when I was at Salesforce and Zendesk, I knew 80% of my revenue heading into the year because of the SaaS model. That's not the same in a dynamic payment volume business. So we just have to approach it slightly differently.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of things. First of all, we're very aligned, and that's kind of unusual when it comes to forecasting, as Jeff said, it's very individual. But I think we're all sort of the Jeff Epstein school of thought on the Goldilocks budget. Again, I'll chime in. That's a must read if you want to be budgeting. You have to understand that. And I think I'll call it a couple of things along my answer here. But the one thing that's really important that Elena, you referenced is the shape of the budget. She starts top down. And I think that's really critical to have here's where we're going from a long-term point of view. If we want to be there in 3 years, here's where we need to be this year. I think that most companies, especially CFOs early in their career, will start bottoms up with like, what do you think we can deliver? And the team will say what they can deliver. And then you pull it up and it'll invariably look terrible because people will say they can deliver very little and they need a lot of cost. And then when you want to shift that from here back to the teams, what you're going to end up doing is pulling back a lot of costs and adding a lot of revenue. And people have this emotional attachment to what they anchored on the first time. And so I think it's very important, instead of an N-shaped budget goes bottoms up, top down, bottoms up, to have a V-shaped budget. You start top down, you give the goal and the constraints, and then give to people, say, hey, here's what we want from you. What can you deliver within these constraints and these goals? And then they will come back with a request, and it comes back to the top down. I think that's super important, even though it's counterintuitive. If you ask people what they can deliver, you're going to get a worse budget and have a worse NPS in the budgeting experience than if you tell them what they need to deliver, because people anchor against what they did the first time they work on. So that's the first one I would say, super critical. The second one is, I think, having principles with the board of what you're trying to achieve. And this comes back to the classic Goldilocks article, but you should say to the board, like, our forecast is we think we're going to hit it 50% of the time. We think we're going to hit it 30% of the time, or 90%. Because if you have one board member who thinks, oh, this is a beat and raise model where you're going to hit it 90% of the time, another board member who thinks it's a stretch target, you're going to have a very hard time having that conversation. And so the principles of what you're trying to achieve, I think, are really important. And what are sort of like the underlying guidances for me at our company? It's okay, we want to maximize growth as much as possible within the constraint of a certain level of profitability. And point three, showing consistent operating leverage year after year after year. And we say that before we kick off the budget process, like, do we agree on these three things and this level of probability? And if you agree on those kind of guiding principles, I think it drives a lot of alignment. What makes the budgeting process miserable is misalignment and expectations and anchors that are hard to unwind. And so I think that if you have not read, I'm going to say it last time, the Goldilocks budget, it is like the must-have, because it forces the alignment and it removes the anchors. So that's all the only things I'd add. Otherwise, we're spot on.
When we talk about the Goldilocks budget, we talk about, is something aspirational, or is it very conservative? And I just read an article this week about Elon Musk. In 2015, he gave a presentation about SpaceX to investors where he predicted $12 billion of revenue in 2022. And they had 1.4 billion in revenue in 2022. So still pretty impressive to go from nothing to 1.4 billion, but he was 90% off. So Elon is sort of the poster child for the aspirational budget. And I think when he makes forecasts, people understand he's not predicting the future. He's talking about his dreams. Amazon has written a lot about their methodologies, about metrics, and there's a great book called Working Backwards, where they talk about input metrics compared to output metrics. And I'd be interested in, from our panelists, what's your experience been, and what's your view about looking at input versus output metrics?
I think I'll kick this off, Jeff. I think from my perspective, one, when we think about metrics for our business, really probably the first thing I think about from the finance lens is actually to go beyond the financials. Most metrics that we look at, I sort of say, if it's got a dollar sign, it's a lagging metric. That all the leading metrics are operational metrics, and very, very few of them actually have a dollar sign in front of the metrics. So if you want to be really relevant in that universe, I think that shifting the focus from outputs to inputs is really, really essential. And I think the second piece of that I think about is like, that is then a journey, and it's sort of a question of introspection. You kind of start with, I heard Dave and probably Elena also say this, you have to start with the anchor and strategy. Like, where are we trying to get to? Both, what's the North Star? What's the performance that we expect? What's the profile that we want from the business? But then this idea of working backwards to the pieces that you need. In my experience, very quickly, we get to places where we go, oh, I'd really like to be able to measure X. And then we realize, oh my gosh, we can't. And when you get there, I guess the one thing that I keep coming back to is like, that's actually great, because now you've uncovered the next stone to turn over on that capability you want to build, or something that you couldn't instrument before, or you hadn't instrumented before, that now you know where to focus as a team, so that you've uncovered the lever that you want the business to be able to pull. And when you get to those clarities of, hey, great, we know these inputs matter. And when we move this input in a predictable way, we actually get a predictable output in return. I think that's where companies really start to find their, find their lane. And I think when you read the Amazon example, that's sort of exactly what Amazon did. And they just got really, really good at running their business.
Yeah, I would echo everything you said, Chris. And, I think if you can get alignment around a handful of input metrics that matter, I think one thing that I've seen over my career is the more focused you can get to the 3 to 5 needle moving input metrics, the better. Because it also, you've seen, I'm sure we've all seen this, where someone shows up with 20 metrics and you're not quite sure which one's the most important. And so as a CFO, I think one thing you can do is align the organization on these are the metrics that really matter. There's a lot of underlying metrics, of course, but these are the ones that we should spend time with as an executive team talking about. And then to the point on input and output, absolutely very critical. An example of that that I can give is, if you think about, we're trying to manage our, once we acquire a customer, how much it costs to serve that customer, so we can get to lifetime value and all these things. And so cost to serve, by the time I see that number, it's too late. What I really want to know is how many times are our customers calling us and why are they calling us? And what's the average handle time, and how many reps do we need or agents do we need to support those customers? But it all is embedded in understanding, well, why do our customers call us to begin with? And can we try to, optimize that? And then that will have a knockoff effect on the output, which is cost to serve. So I just wanted to give an example.
Very good. Elena, let's follow up with you talking about IPOs. We've seen the IPO market open with Instacart, Klaviyo, and Arm. And you joined Toast just a few months before its blockbuster IPO back in 2021. Can you share advice to other CEOs and CFOs on what the ramp was like, and what were the hardest parts about preparing for an IPO?
Yeah, I guess my first advice is give yourself more time. Like I felt like I joined the company, and it was, if those of you who are baseball fans, it was like the 9th inning, bases loaded, two men on, and like, hey, go take the company public. So I would recommend maybe join in the 4th inning and not the 9th inning with bases loaded. But anyway, that aside, my ramp was like a boot camp almost. If you could think about the hardest boot camp you've ever had, that's what my ramp was like. And my focus was really around a few things. One is belief in the narrative, the strategy. Do we have the addressable TAM? And what is our strategy and our vision? Like I had to know that cold and feel really good about that. The other one was building relationships with investors, who some I had known from Zendesk, but some I did not. So building those relationships, and also with the board. The board, I knew a couple board members, but making sure I understood what they wanted out of this IPO, what their expectations were. And then it goes without saying, I had to really calibrate the team I had, the talent that I had, and make sure that they were ready to be public company leaders. And so I had to, if I give some advice, is make sure you have on your team people who've done it before in a public company setting. I did not get there and find that. So I had to bring public company experience, and I'm still doing that actually. And then the last thing I'll say is, picking the metrics for an IPO are so critical. And I think all of us can share that, less is more often, because you want to give yourself the flexibility to operate your business for what you're trying to do. But at the same time, that has to be balanced, because if you don't give certain metrics, they might think you're hiding something. So a real live example, we went public and didn't talk about our locations other than at the IPO. And it was a big debate we had back and forth. Should we, shouldn't we? We ended up actually then adding locations after our first earnings call as a public company, because at the end of the day, they wanted to know how many restaurants are powered by Toast. What we were trying to manage for was, well, we don't want them focused only on ARPU, so let's not give them the location number. And that ultimately was not the right decision. And we learned from that very quickly. But that decision on what metrics to show is really critical. So I would get sound bites from, I think Chris mentioned it and Dave, like get your network and talk through these very critical decisions if you're on the path to IPO.
Very good.
Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question? Sorry, I'm just so curious on that one point, Jeff.
Yeah.
Elena, how did you think about, I mean, because Jeff asked a question a minute ago on input, output metrics, like sort of there's often conversation about internal voice of what you talk about internally and outside voice, what you talk about to your board, and then really outside voice, what you talk about to the street. How did you think about the consistency of those three, or what you thought was a great metric to show externally, but maybe not one that drove internally? How did you think of that trade-off between inside voice and outside voice?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we anchored on, and we still continue, if you hear my earnings scripts, you'll continue to anchor on ARR as our North Star metric. And that's consistent in and out. Same with locations and ARPU. So we try to stick to the principle of let's try to be as consistent as we can with external and internal, except that the internal metrics are going to have a lot more texture than we give externally. And so as an example, they would love for me to tell them how many locations do you have in the enterprise segment versus the SMB segment, or how many locations do you have internationally? That texture we keep internally until at the right time, I feel like it's important to share it to kind of make sure they have the texture of the business. But that's just an example. They would love to know, for example, what is your booking ARPU versus the average booking of your business, right? We give it sometimes, we don't give it all the time, because we don't want that to indicate anything other than, hey, the dynamics of our business are changing over time. As an example, they would love to share that. So we try to be really balanced, but on the whole, the most important thing is making sure we're giving enough information for them to believe in our story. And we happen to believe that we've got a great story to tell. So, but we're trying to keep it consistent.
Elena, I just wanted to double down on one thing you said, because I think we were talking about this in the context of a public company, but I think also very relevant in the private company lens. I ascribe to that belief of, hey, when you're looking at metrics, inside needs to equal outside. Thinking about the alternative, which is, hey, we have this metric, we think it's important maybe to our board or our investors or something like that, but we really don't look at it that often internally. I would say, like, for anyone who's listening to that feels like that's a trap, like watch out for that trap.
100%.
And those are and so to your point, that the fidelity inside, as you go from this is important externally to those sets of stakeholders. I like how you described the texture increases when you go internal, but I would say a watch out for everybody is if you find an external metric that you're not operationally focused on every single day and that your team is focused on, then it's probably time to change your external metric, because you're kind of in the danger zone.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely right.
Yeah, that's why I asked. I mean, I think it's tricky when there are certain metrics that the market always wants, and it may not be one that drives your business. It's like, there's that tension. Maybe you disclose it in the S1, but not on a recurring basis, but you have to be thoughtful. And that's why I thought it was so interesting that you referenced this, Elena, because that decision-making around what you disclose becomes in some way permanent because models get built around it. And exactly. That's why I thought it was so interesting. I want to reinforce that point, that you hear how you thought about it, because it's so relevant for us.
Great.
Very good. And of course, the big news in technology in the last year has been artificial intelligence and ChatGPT. I'm going to share my screen here to show an overview of, let's see if I can everyone see that? Benefits of ChatGPT for business in the finance department: productivity, tutorials, scenario analysis, creating business procedures, and writing emails, communications. It's early days. Have you experimented with large language models and AI and ChatGPT in finance or elsewhere in your organization? What has your experience been, and what are your expectations over the next year or two?
Yeah, I'm happy to start and then have others chime in. I think for us, first of all, very early days. So I'd be lying if we would say we're all over it. That said, I think there's a lot of great ideas, and what we think about, for example, at Toast, is the power of the data we have across all of our restaurants, and how we could potentially at the right time with the right privacy and following all the rules, how we can leverage that data to not only help ourselves, but help our customers. We do a light bit of AI with our Toast Capital program, where we extend credit and we look at some of the data there to help us model what credit worthiness customer is. But let me provide a framework of how we're thinking about it, because we're so early. I think the one thing is we think, how can we serve our customers better? And we're testing and looking for very specific use cases around our customer and our platform. And there's probably 20 use cases. We're going to try to focus on 1 or 2 with high impact. And that'll take some time. And then we think about the products that we give our customers, like how do we think about leveraging AI within the product that a customer may not even see, but we know it'll be a better tool for the customer. And then finally, we're thinking about our own internal productivity, like on my finance team, for example, or in engineering with developers. And what are the use cases where somehow we can improve our internal productivity? And so we have an AI council, if you will, looking at all of the ideas. And some of it will be them making sure we follow all the rules, but also prioritizing, because as you can imagine, everyone's really excited, lots of ideas, but we've got to prioritize which ones will have the highest impact for both our customers and our employees.
Maybe just to put a couple real examples behind that. I love the framework, Elena, because we're thinking about it really much the same way. And it is that balance of, we all work in high growth companies, we're in technology, you kind of want to be on that edge, but I think there's 2 risks. One is obviously nobody wants to have sort of disruptions. Like I think everyone looks at the Zoom example as like, there's just a lot of uncertainty, there's confusion, you don't want to confuse your customers, and you also want to make sure you're protecting your business in the right ways. And then at the same time, I think also like it's easy right now to get caught in the hype cycle and be like, well, we're going to do AI everywhere. And we also know that in a growth company, like focus and prioritization is incredibly important. And so I think we're starting to look at a few places where we see where that kind of like the ROI for us just pencils out high enough that you'd say, great, we're going to focus on these areas, because even if we're wrong about the kind of productivity we could get out, it's kind of a no-brainer. So we're thinking about how we can do that in forecasting. We have a lot of data-driven forecasting at Guild today. Our revenue forecasting is happening in Python. We have some pretty complex customer models that we're running. And we're looking at ways like, how do we make that faster or more iterative, or where something like ML can come in and help us think about more scenarios. The second piece that we're look at is like automation of manual tasks. So maybe that's on the accounting side, or maybe we have a payments. Payments is like a pretty essential part of Guild's product. And we still have a lot of manual tasks in some of those workflows today. And so we think about that as a big priority for automation and where we can see some leverage. I think also recognizing as a company, like we're not going to build everything. And in many cases, we're going to be relying on the technology partners we have in Guild's tech stack to deliver that. So as sitting in the CFO seat, and I do have responsibility at Guild for our business systems, but as I'm talking with our partners, and maybe that's Workday or Salesforce or really any platform that we use in the company, I'm spending a lot of time asking them about their roadmaps, how they're riding that innovation curve, where the use cases that they're prioritizing, as a guide from where we can leverage their innovation and apply it most quickly to our business.
Very good. And if Dave, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only things I'd say are, there's a lot of AI. When we talk about AI, I think people are mostly talking about generative AI, but Chris and Elena made a great point. Like there has been machine learning for some time, which definitely drives our forecasting of our payments volume today, and has been for some time. The automation is a critical part of what we do in finance, because we have to scale G&A has to have a lot of operating leverage. Like I think part of our job is to show operating leverage is a business, and we have to lead that way. And so I think, Chris, your point on automation is critical. The only place today we've seen AI in the finance suite is on data cleanup. I mean, we're just awash in data, but as you look at longer and longer back in time, your probably quality standards were lower and how you kept records and what how you classified things. And so if you want to go through it back in time, it's actually quite difficult. And that's where we've had an early experience of generative AI being productive. I think that, Elena, you made a point about the customer side. That's actually one where us at ServiceTitan, we have now 2 SKUs that are AI oriented. And so that our CTO was the CTO was the ran Einstein at Salesforce. So he was the AI leader at Salesforce. But I think in the finance back office, Chris, your point 100%, it'll be driven by the vendors. Very little will be created by us and our teams on generative AI, if not provided by the vendors. And I think that there will be a lot of things in like how we deal with AP and AR and closing the books that'll make it so AI does a lot of that work for us. But it will almost certainly be driven by the vendors and how we adopt it, not driven by us internally.
Okay, in a few minutes, we're going to open it up to the audience Q&A, but first, there's a chance for each of you to ask questions of each other. So what kinds of questions would you have for each other? Chris, so we can start with you.
Thanks. I mean, the dialogue here has already been really awesome, just hearing the examples. I think, Dave, maybe kicking it to you, you said you're about 3 months into a new company, new CFO gig. And obviously you've done that a few times before. What's the approach you take, whether you're in the first 90 days camp or the first 12 months camp, but how do you go about approaching new company, new team, new business?
Amazing. I'm not sure I have like the world's best framework, but I'll give it. I think about it in sort of 4 fronts. The first is, and I think Elena, you said this earlier on, we have to understand how the business operates deeply in the company. Like I think one of the traps for a CFO is to get swayed by the magic of Excel. Excel can look beautiful or look terrible based on the inputs that you have, but you have to know how those inputs actually drive the business. And so for the first 90 days, a lot of it is for me meeting customers, frankly, because we have some very large customers, and then spending time with my peers and leaders throughout the organization. I think that I need to know how things actually operate for me to be able to say if the Excel is right or wrong. And so that's the first and probably the most important. The second is on building a long-term and a short-term view of the business. I think like forcing you to have a forecast that's both long and short-term makes you understand the components of what you're getting, the color externally, touching the Excel internally to have a view of where the business is going. I think that Jeff referenced the working backwards, and Elena referenced the importance of having 3 to 5 key metrics. I think that's super critical, saying, okay, what do I think the 3 to 5 key metrics, and where do I think they'll be, and work backwards from what are the drivers there. And so I've spent a lot of my time the first 90 days picking the metrics and building a long-term plan and developing a forecast. And then, we'll see how accurate my forecast is for the next 6 months and over the next couple of years. But I think you learn a lot by forcing yourself to go through that process. The third one is around team. I think that, Elena, you said you want to make sure you have the team that can take you to the promised land of being a public company. It's really critical, especially your leaders. You spend a lot of time with them and figuring out like who could be in a bigger seat, who maybe doesn't fit the seat they're in. How do you think about organizing the team that fits your style? Because it's not so much that one person's good or bad. It's a lot about how they match you and they match other players. And so the third is definitely the team. And the last one, though not the most exciting thing, is you need to make sure you've reviewed the numbers and the accounting in depth. At the end of the day, you will be accountable for the numbers, and you need to make sure where the judgment call, because there are judgment calls in accounting, that you're comfortable with them. And so I think over the first 90 days, I focus on those 4 areas and try really, really hard to limit the scope elsewhere. There will be a tendency in the organization to pull the CFO, especially for us here, we didn't have a CFO for 9 months, into lots of different topics. And what you don't want to do is dilute those first 4 things, because you don't have that opportunity to go back in time and ramp again. Like if in you're 18 months in, you want to learn the product, people are gonna be like, well, come on, man, like that window passed. So you need to make sure you nail those 4. We'll see how well I did on those 4, but those for me were the core 4 in my first 90 days. And then over time now I'm sort of adding scope back into a normal CFO routine.
Very good. Let's go to audience questions. Jason Gaines is asking, how long into the plan year do you wait before you make big changes? Let's say revenue or churn or NDR growth is not coming in as expected. Do you do a hard reset, soft? If so, when? How do you make those judgment calls?
I'll kick off on this. I think I mentioned earlier, we think a lot about you want to plan iteratively. So I think while you want to set a plan, recognizing that that plan is a scenario, and in some ways, the day your plan is written, it's immediately wrong. And so the question is, how are you gathering feedback along the way to be able to test that both on the things that are working and the things that aren't? And so I think we try to stay open to that as much as possible, but also, recognize that you don't need a flexible plan of record. People need to know the constraints or the guardrails under which they're operating. And so, the plan also, we are pretty disciplined about when we make changes to the plan, but remain nimble on that. I think 2 lessons learned. One, I have the belief like bad news does not get better with age. And so if you need to do a reset, don't wait. Do the assessment, take the medicine, and realize like, hey, if we need to change the goals or we over rotated on cost, waiting. Every time I've been in a position where maybe I've ended up realizing later that we waited longer than we should have, I've regretted it. And then the second, I would say, is when you have to do a reset. A little bit, I think this translates to private companies, but certainly you could see this play out in public. If you're going to do a reset, do one. Don't do a half a reset and then come back 3 or 6 months later and realize that you actually needed to do a bigger one. So take the medicine, and really focus in on if you need to change the plan, do it in the way that you need to so that you can get back to operating the business.
Yeah, I think it did. I agree with everything you said, Chris. I think it also depends if you're public or private, and how you manage. But my view is, your board plan obviously that never changes, it just can't. But we have 3 outlooks throughout the year, at the start of a quarter. And so to me, I try to focus on making sure those outlooks reflect the best and latest information we have on the business. And that's a forcing function for everyone to lock arms and really get on the same page. Intra-quarter, when it's not outlook time, I lean on the forecast throughout the quarter to kind of give me the pulse of the business, but I try not to change the goalpost other than at an outlook. And even then, like the nirvana would be your outlooks match your board plan. That never has happened for me ever in my life. But however, we try to use like the closest to the pin mindset, if you will, and try to get to back to board plan as much as we can. But we try to stick to quarterly, and I don't like to reset a plan other than during that time and do it, to Chris's point, almost as an exception, not the norm.
Yeah, I agree. I think I would build some buffer in the beginning of the year so that you don't have to reset too early. I think that the amount of thrash and exhaustion that comes from a full planning process is often understated by the finance department because we're sort of holding the whip, whereas the people in the rest of the organization are the tip of the whip and they have their normal day jobs. And so doing it early in the year is quite painful. When you're talking about resetting the plan, and I think the question was regarding resetting the AOP, what people are more often talking about is what Chris said, it's like you're missing big time and you need to cut back on costs. And that's really painful. It happens all the time. I would push you to have the flexibility in Q1 that you don't need to do it until mid-year, because people will start to feel like they're constantly planning, and then that will create an enormous tax in the business. And so the flexibility and where the stretch should be in the plan is not in the first quarter. And you should have enough early signals, per Jeff's point on working backwards, you should have enough early signals by mid-year to know if you're going to miss the second half of the year, but you should be in a position where A, you have enough risk management to know you're not going to run out of cash, and B, you have enough flexibility the first half of the year that you don't have to make the replanning if you can. Because if you have people feel like they're cutting costs every 3 months or they're adjusting their plan every 6 months, they're going to be exhausted, and there will be a lot of resentment around the planning process, and it'll be sort of ENPS death spiral. So that's my push, is to have a lot of flexibility Q1 and the stretch in Q4.
Yeah, I would double down on you don't want to have planning fatigue set in the business ever, if you can avoid it.
Very good. We have another question from Roy Heffer. who says that we figured out how to measure sales productivity and to some extent marketing productivity, but how do you measure technology investment? What's the ROI on tech investment, and how do you figure out whether they should get more or less? We've stumped the panel.
The ever dream question.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
I mean,
Okay. Good, Dave.
Sorry, I would say that there's not a great answer. This is where the art and science is big. I think it's something you learn over time by having, if you can have discrete projects and how that ROI compares, and then people like showing how people's ROI forecasts were versus what they said they were. Like, I think, Jeff once told me, if you have a cost savings initiative, you should budget it for it to be a 10x, because the cost savings will come in half and the time to execute will double. And so if you really want to have a 3x ROI and cost savings initiative, you should plan for a 10x. And I think like that, every company does differently on ROI. I think cost savings is definitely the 10x is the right rule of thumb, but on your business and the ROI of R&D will vary a lot, and it'll depend on the orientation of the founder. Most of us, I think, work for founder-led organizations, not all of us, but a lot of founders tend to have a specific view on R&D. And so the only way to really drive them, in my opinion, is through data over time on how our forecasts have measured. And then so if they say, okay, this is going to generate $1 million and a year later it's $1 million, like, you're going to feel pretty good about that ROI forecast. If it's always half that, you will help guide them over time to say, okay, we'll handicap your expectation by half. But on a quarter to quarter basis of looking at ROI spend, really, really, really hard, because the time horizon is just longer. It's not like sales, it's not like marketing.
Okay. The next question is from Rose Chen, who asks about AI and cash management. Have you seen or have you heard about the idea of using AI to more accurately forecast your cash?
It gets really early. And again, I think AI is the buzzword, but there's been algorithms and machine learning and other things like that in place for a long time. So I've always believed, given how much data there is about the balance sheet and other things, that cash should be one of those things that lends itself to a lot of automation and forecasting. But I haven't seen AI specifically coming to bear on that yet, beyond some of the other modalities that have, I think, been in place for a while.
Okay, another cash-related question. Interest rates are going up now. For a while, it didn't matter what you did with your cash because you weren't doing anything on it. We have a question from Shoaib Khan. Where are you investing your cash, and do you have recommendations for the audience?
We're not going to drive the share price by having the incremental yield. You will drive the share price a lot down if you lose that money. For me, especially when you're losing cash, I'm pretty conservative. I have it in money market funds. I mean,
not crypto is probably a good
crypto. I'm not so bold on this one. I tend to be pretty conservative, and I was at TPG Capital when Washington Mutual failed 15 years ago, and so I've always been fearful of smaller banks, and so I was proven right finally when SVB collapsed. But I think that I'm in big banks, large money market funds, yield management. I'm not like that. Incremental 10 basis points is probably not where I'm going to get my annual bonus from, candidly.
Yeah, we're similar. Very very thoughtful about that. And I mean, I think the one thing that I'm starting to spend more time on with my board, and I'm sure you guys are too, is as you get to free cash flow positive, like, how will you use that cash? What's your capital allocation strategy? Are you gonna, for example, is M&A something you're thinking about in this environment or not? How much is it going to go to operations? How much of your cash is restricted? And how should one think about how much cash you need on your balance sheet and runway, so that you know how much room you have on your balance sheet to use that cash? So we're having some of those high level philosophical alignments, and you can imagine it's not every founder thinks the same about that. And so I think it's really important to walk through the uses of cash and sort of what the next few years look like.
Very good. We've had a request to go back to the R&D question on how to evaluate the ROI on technology. And Chris and Elena, I didn't give you a chance to answer. So if you have other thoughts, wanted to give you a chance to answer now.
I think like one piece I would add, because Dave said this earlier, he talked about like guardrails and thinking about something like ultimate level of profitability, or even obviously we think about something like R&D as a percentage of revenue. There's some like reasonable guardrails that based on the stage of your company, I think you are trying to fit inside. So one is when we think about like how might we change our level of investment year over year, we kind of know the general shape of like what we want that to look like. And then we're kind of, you know, plus and minus against that. I'm a big fan also of triangulation. So I'm a little still put me in the skeptic category of really over indexing on we're going to measure ROI. Just A, it's hard. It takes a lot of work. And B, again, agree with the 10x delta versus the 3x reality. And so one is we are putting more and more focus on actually just measuring productivity and output. Some of the new tooling out there in terms of getting developer metrics and then starting to see how those trend over time is a good measurement of just, again, how is the base level productivity. And then we also think about really a version of kind of capital allocation inside of that. So across R&D type projects, whether it's focusing on infrastructure, focusing on, you know, customer features and growth initiatives, we look at how we've allocated our R&D resource across those. And we're starting to think about how have we allocated that resource. If you've seen the model of like Horizon 1 of your business versus Horizon 2 and Horizon 3, you have a lot of eggs in the kind of Horizon 1 basket, but you also need to make sure that you're putting bets on the table for Horizon 2 or even Horizon 3, because those are bets that are going to have to pay off. And so I would also probably say, don't get overly focused on the R part of the ROI. We're a technology business. And so we are going to make bets that are not going to pan out. And what you don't also want to do is stifle that innovation that your customers are counting on for the future. So we're trying to find the right balance between wanting productivity, wanting scaling, but also recognizing we've got to deliver innovation for our clients for many years to come.
Yeah, I would echo all of that. The only thing I would add that has been helpful to me has been benchmarking other like-sized companies and bringing that to my leaders. Because when I actually try to push and ask for like, what does this look like? It's like, well, this person's, you know, this company's doing it this way and this company's doing it that way. But the reality is when you see fact and data, it just orients everyone to, oh, I see, like this is where we need to be for a world-class company. R&D as a percentage of revenue should be X. That's been probably the most important thing. Horizons, we look at that too. I guess the only other thing that we're doing is making sure that if we have, say, these 5 priorities in the business for 2024, how much of our R&D spend is going specifically to those priorities? And if it's the answer we don't like, then we can come back and say, well, maybe we need to point more resources to these priorities. And so that's also been helpful because I think everyone can align around it.
Well, thank you to everyone who joined this call and to our amazing chief financial officers for the insights that they shared today. We plan on sharing all the takeaways from this conversation in an upcoming Atlas article. If you learned something new today, be sure to share the SaaS Finance course with your team, a founder, or even a friend. Thank you.